Camilla stood at the airport terminal, her heart racing as she clutched her passport. The morning sun streamed through the large windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. She had been planning this trip for months, a much-needed escape from the pressures of royal life. Her destination was a small cottage in the French countryside, where she hoped to find peace and quiet away from the constant scrutiny of the media. The airport was unusually busy for a Tuesday morning. Families rushed past with their suitcases. Business travelers typed furiously on their phones, and children laughed as they ran between the rows of seats. Camilla tried to blend in with the crowd, wearing a simple cream-colored coat and dark sunglasses. She had deliberately chosen an early flight, hoping to avoid attention. As she approached the security checkpoint, Camilla noticed something strange. Two royal guards in their distinctive red uniforms were standing near the departure gate. This was odd because royal guards were not typically stationed at civilian airports. They were meant to protect palaces and official royal residences, not monitor public transportation hubs. The guards seemed to be scanning the crowd, their eyes moving methodically from person to person. Camilla felt a chill run down her spine. She had specifically chosen this small regional airport to avoid any complications. The larger airports would have been crawling with security personnel who might recognize her. But this place was supposed to be different. She tried to walk casually toward the check-in counter, pulling her hat down lower over her face. Her hands trembled slightly as she handed her ticket to the airline representative. The young woman behind the counter smiled politely and processed her boarding pass without any sign of recognition. "Have a wonderful trip." "Ma'am," the clerk said cheerfully. Camilla managed a weak smile in return. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the terminal. As she turned away from the counter, she saw that one of the royal guards was now walking directly toward her. His face was stern and professional, showing no emotion. Behind him, his partner spoke quietly into a radio device, never taking his eyes off Camilla. The approaching guard was tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that commanded respect. His uniform was immaculate, every button polished to perfection. A ceremonial sword hung at his side, though Camilla knew he also carried more modern means of enforcement. "Excuse me, ma'am," the guard said as he reached her position. His voice was deep and formal, carrying the authority of his position. "I need to speak with you for a moment." Camilla's stomach dropped. She had hoped against hope that she might slip away unnoticed, but it seemed her carefully laid plans were about to crumble. The other passengers in the terminal began to take notice of the situation. Some stopped to stare, while others whispered among themselves, trying to figure out what was happening. "Is there a problem, officer?" Camilla asked, attempting to keep her voice steady. She knew it was pointless to pretend she didn't know why he was there, but she wasn't ready to give up on her escape just yet. The guard's expression remained unchanged. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with me. There are some matters that require your immediate attention." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Camilla felt the walls of her carefully constructed plan closing in around her. The freedom she had dreamed of, the peaceful cottage in France, the walks through lavender fields, all of it was slipping away before her eyes. Other travelers were now openly staring at the scene unfolding before them. Some had pulled out their phones and were recording, though they probably had no idea who Camilla was or why the royal guards were involved. The situation was attracting exactly the kind of attention she had been trying to avoid. Camilla looked around the terminal desperately, as if searching for an escape route. But she knew there was nowhere to run. The royal guards were trained professionals, and this was their job. They had been sent here for a specific purpose, and they would not be deterred by her protests or pleas. The second guard had now joined his partner, forming a protective barrier around Camilla. They were not aggressive or threatening, but their presence made it clear that she had no choice but to comply with their instructions. "Please, ma'am," the first guard said again, his tone remaining respectful but firm. "We need to resolve this matter quickly and quietly." Camilla realized that the longer she delayed, the more attention they would attract. Already, a small crowd was beginning to form around them. Airport security personnel were also starting to take notice, and she could see them moving in their direction. With a heavy sigh, Camilla nodded her acceptance. Her dream of escape was over before it had even begun. Whatever had prompted the royal guards to intercept her at the airport, it was clearly serious enough that normal protocols had been abandoned. As they began to escort her away from the departure area, Camilla took one last look at the boarding gate where her flight to France was preparing to depart. The plane that should have carried her to freedom was now just another reminder of the gilded cage that defined her life. The royal guards led Camilla to a small private room near the airport's administrative offices. The space was plain and sterile, furnished only with a metal table and 3 chairs. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the concrete walls. It felt more like an interrogation room than a place for polite conversation. Camilla sat down heavily in one of the chairs, her shoulders sagging with defeat. The weight of her situation was beginning to sink in. She had been so careful with her planning, so meticulous in her preparations. How had they known? Who had betrayed her trust? The first guard, who introduced himself as Captain Morrison, remained standing while his partner took position by the door. Morrison's face was weathered and serious, suggesting years of loyal service to the crown. His eyes held a mixture of duty and something that might have been sympathy. "Ma'am, I need to inform you that your departure from the country has been temporarily suspended," Morrison said, his voice maintaining its professional tone. "There are urgent matters requiring your immediate return to the palace." Camilla looked up at him with exhausted eyes. "What kind of urgent matters?" she asked, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. In her experience, urgent royal matters rarely brought good news. Morrison hesitated for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. "I'm not at liberty to discuss the specific details, ma'am. My orders are simply to ensure your safe return and to secure any personal items you intended to take with you." The mention of her personal items sent a fresh wave of panic through Camilla. Her luggage contained more than just clothes and toiletries. Hidden among her belongings were personal letters, photographs, and a diary that documented her most private thoughts about royal life. If those items fell into the wrong hands, the consequences could be devastating. "My luggage," she said quickly. "Surely that's not necessary. It's just personal clothing and—" "I'm sorry, ma'am," Morrison interrupted gently but firmly. "Those are my orders. Everything must be examined and catalogued before it can be returned to you." Through the small window of the room, Camilla could see airport workers loading and unloading planes on the tarmac. Normal people going about their normal lives, free to travel wherever they pleased without royal guards blocking their path. She envied them more than they could ever know. Morrison's radio crackled to life, and he stepped aside to take the call. Camilla couldn't make out the words, but she could hear the urgency in the voice on the other end. When Morrison returned, his expression had grown even more serious. "Ma'am, I've just received word that your luggage has been located and is being brought here for inspection," he said. "The process should be completed within the hour." Camilla felt her heart sink even further. An hour was more than enough time for them to discover everything she had been trying to keep hidden. The letters from her sister, expressing doubts about the royal family's treatment of Camilla. The photographs from her brief romance with a commoner, a relationship that had been deemed unsuitable and quietly ended. The diary entries where she had poured out her frustrations and dreams of a different life. "Captain Morrison," she said, trying to keep desperation out of her voice, "surely we can discuss this reasonably. I'm not a criminal. I'm not trying to flee justice or abandon my responsibilities. I simply wanted a few weeks of privacy." Morrison's expression softened slightly. "Ma'am, I understand this is difficult, but these orders come from the highest levels. There are concerns about security and protocol that are beyond my authority to address." The second guard, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward and whispered something in Morrison's ear. Camilla watched their faces carefully, trying to read any clues about what might be happening, but both men were trained to reveal nothing through their expressions. A knock at the door interrupted the tense silence. A uniformed airport security officer entered, followed by 2 men wheeling Camilla's expensive leather suitcases on a cart. The sight of her belongings being handled by strangers made her feel violated and powerless. "We'll need to examine these thoroughly," Morrison explained as the suitcases were placed on the metal table. "It's standard procedure for situations like this." Camilla wanted to ask what exactly constituted situations like this, but she suspected she wouldn't get a straight answer. Instead, she watched helplessly as Morrison began to unlock the first suitcase with a key that must have been provided by airport security. Inside were her carefully folded clothes, selected specifically for her planned retreat in France. Silk blouses, comfortable walking shoes, a warm coat for evening strolls through the countryside. Each item represented a dream that was now being systematically dismantled before her eyes. Morrison worked methodically, examining each piece of clothing and checking for hidden compartments or unusual items. His partner documented everything on a clipboard, creating an official record of the search. The process was professional, but deeply humiliating for Camilla. As Morrison reached the bottom of the first suitcase, Camilla held her breath. Hidden beneath a false bottom were the items she most feared having discovered: the letters, the photographs, the diary, everything that could potentially cause a scandal if made public. Morrison's hand paused as he felt the irregularity in the suitcase's construction. He looked up at Camilla, his expression unreadable. With practiced efficiency, he located the hidden catch and opened the secret compartment. The silence in the room became deafening as Morrison carefully removed the bundle of letters tied with a blue ribbon. Camilla closed her eyes, unable to watch as her most private possessions were exposed to official scrutiny. This was her worst nightmare coming true, and there was absolutely nothing she could do to stop it. Captain Morrison held the bundle of letters in his hands, his expression growing more troubled as he examined them. The blue ribbon that held them together was faded and worn, suggesting these were treasured keepsakes that had been read many times. Camilla watched his face carefully, trying to gauge his reaction to this unexpected discovery. "Ma'am," Morrison said quietly, "these appear to be personal correspondence. However, given the circumstances, I'm required to examine them for security purposes." Camilla felt tears welling up in her eyes. "Those are private letters from my sister," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Please, Captain, they have nothing to do with state security or royal protocol. They're just the thoughts of two sisters who rarely get to speak honestly with each other." Morrison's partner looked uncomfortable with the emotional turn the situation had taken. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other and avoided making eye contact with Camilla. It was clear that neither guard had expected their duty to involve such a personal violation of privacy. "I understand your concerns, ma'am," Morrison replied, "but I have my orders. However, I can assure you that anything not related to security matters will be treated with the utmost discretion." As Morrison carefully untied the ribbon, Camilla couldn't help but think about how those letters had sustained her through some of the darkest periods of her royal life. Her sister lived in Australia, far from the constraints and expectations of the royal family. Through their correspondence, Camilla had been able to express feelings and doubts that she could never voice to anyone else. The first letter Morrison opened was dated just 3 months earlier. Camilla remembered writing it after a particularly difficult state dinner, where she had been criticized for her choice of dress and her conversation with a foreign diplomat. In the letter, she had poured out her frustrations about the constant scrutiny and the impossible standards she was expected to meet. Morrison's eyes moved across the handwritten pages, and Camilla could see his expression changing. There was less of the professional detachment and more of what looked like genuine concern. Whatever he was reading was clearly affecting him. "Captain," Camilla said softly, "my sister is the only person in the world who truly understands what this life is like. Those letters are my lifeline to sanity. Please don't let them become ammunition for people who want to use my private thoughts against me." The second guard stepped forward and whispered something urgent in Morrison's ear. Morrison nodded grimly and carefully placed the letters back in their bundle. He then reached into the hidden compartment and withdrew a small photo album bound in leather. Camilla's heart rate increased dramatically. The photo album contained pictures from what she considered the happiest time of her life, a brief period when she had fallen in love with a man who wasn't part of the royal world. He was a doctor who worked with children in impoverished areas, someone who had never cared about her title or status. "Ma'am, I need to examine these photographs as well," Morrison said, though his tone had become gentler. "I hope you understand that this is not personal." The photos told the story of a secret romance that had lasted only a few months, but had shown Camilla what genuine happiness could feel like. There were pictures of them walking through a park, sharing a quiet dinner at a small restaurant, laughing together on a beach during a stolen weekend getaway. In every image, Camilla looked radiant and free in a way that her official royal portraits never captured. Morrison studied each photograph carefully, occasionally making notes on his clipboard. When he reached a particular image, one of Camilla and her love interest embracing on a hillside overlooking the ocean, he paused for a long moment. This relationship, Morrison said carefully, was it officially terminated? Camilla nodded, unable to trust her voice. The relationship had indeed been terminated, but not by choice. When palace security had discovered the romance, pressure had been applied to end it immediately. The man she loved had been transferred to a position in a remote area of Africa, effectively ending any possibility of continuing their relationship. Yes, she finally managed to say. It was ended over 2 years ago. Morrison continued through the photographs, each one a painful reminder of what Camilla had lost. There were images of simple, ordinary moments that had meant everything to her. Grocery shopping together, reading books in a quiet cafe, playing with children at a local park. These were the experiences of a normal life that royal protocol had forced her to abandon. The final item in the hidden compartment was Camilla's personal diary, bound in soft brown leather and secured with a small brass lock. Morrison looked at it for a long moment, clearly reluctant to violate this most private of documents. "Captain," Camilla pleaded, "the diary contains only my personal thoughts and feelings, nothing that could possibly be considered a security risk. Please, I'm begging you, don't read it." Morrison held the diary in his hands, weighing it as if trying to determine the weight of the secrets it contained. His radio crackled again, and he answered it with a terse "Morrison here." The conversation was brief and conducted in low tones, but Camilla could sense that something significant was being discussed. When Morrison finished the call, he looked at her with an expression that mixed duty with genuine sympathy. "Ma'am, I've just received additional instructions regarding your situation," he said. "It appears that the matters requiring your return to the palace are more serious than initially indicated." Camilla felt the last of her hope draining away. Whatever was happening, it was clear that her attempted escape had been discovered at exactly the wrong moment. The timing couldn't have been worse, and now her most private possessions were evidence in some kind of investigation she didn't even understand. "What kind of matters?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. Morrison placed the diary back with the other items and closed the hidden compartment. "I'm not authorized to provide those details, ma'am, but I can tell you that your immediate cooperation is essential." The tension in the small airport room became unbearable as Captain Morrison prepared to open Camilla's diary. She watched in horror as he carefully broke the small brass lock, the tiny metallic sound echoing like a gunshot in the silence. This diary represented years of her most private thoughts, fears, and dreams, thoughts she had never shared with another living soul. Morrison opened to the first page, where Camilla had written her name and the date she had started the journal. His eyes scanned the early entries, which mostly contained mundane observations about palace life and her daily routines. But Camilla knew that as he progressed through the pages, he would find increasingly personal and potentially damaging revelations. "Captain Morrison," she said desperately, "before you continue, I need you to understand something. That diary contains my thoughts during some very dark periods of my life. There are entries written when I was at my lowest point, when I felt trapped and hopeless. They don't represent who I am or what I truly believe." Morrison paused in his reading and looked up at her. For the first time since this ordeal began, she could see genuine human emotion in his eyes. "Ma'am, I want you to know that I take no pleasure in this, but recent events have made it necessary to examine everything that might be relevant to your security and well-being." "What recent events?" Camilla asked, her voice rising slightly. "No one has told me anything about why this is happening. I was simply trying to take a private vacation, and now I'm being treated like a criminal or a flight risk." The second guard moved closer to the table, clearly uncomfortable with the emotional intensity of the conversation. Morrison flipped through several more pages of the diary, occasionally stopping to read more carefully. Camilla could tell when he reached the darker entries because his expression grew increasingly troubled. One particular entry, written during a period when Camilla had been struggling with depression, contained thoughts about whether her life had any real meaning or value. She had written about feeling like a prisoner in her own existence, trapped by duties and expectations that felt meaningless to her. Reading those words now in this sterile airport room, She realized how they might be misinterpreted by someone looking for signs of instability or disloyalty. Morrison's radio buzzed again, and this time the voice on the other end was more urgent. He answered quickly and spoke in hushed tones, occasionally glancing at Camilla. When the conversation ended, his demeanor had changed significantly. "Ma'am, I need to ask you some direct questions," Morrison said, closing the diary but keeping it within reach. "In the past 6 months, have you had any contact with foreign nationals or journalists that hasn't been officially reported?" The question caught Camilla off guard. "Foreign nationals? Captain, I meet foreign nationals at every state function and diplomatic event. That's part of my official duties. I'm referring to unofficial contacts, ma'am. Conversations or meetings that occurred outside of formal royal protocols." Camilla's mind raced as she tried to understand what he was getting at. Had someone been monitoring her activities more closely than she realized? Were there aspects of her private life that had been discovered and misinterpreted? "There was a journalist," she admitted reluctantly. "A woman who approached me at a charity event last month. She was writing a book about the modern monarchy and asked if I would consider speaking with her privately." Morrison and his partner exchanged significant looks. "Did you agree to speak with her?" "I told her I would consider it," Camilla said. "But I never actually met with her. I decided it would be inappropriate without official approval." Morrison made notes on his clipboard, his pen scratching loudly in the quiet room. "Ma'am, that journalist has been identified as working for a foreign publication that has been critical of the royal family. Any contact with her, even informal contact, raises security concerns." Camilla felt a chill of fear. "But I didn't actually meet with her. I made the right decision by declining. The concern—" "Ma'am, is that your initial consideration of the meeting, combined with some of the sentiments expressed in your diary and letters, creates a pattern that security officials find troubling?" The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place for Camilla. Someone had been building a case against her, using her private thoughts and innocent interactions as evidence of potential disloyalty or unreliability. The timing of her attempted trip to France had probably been seen as confirmation of their suspicions. "This is ridiculous," she said, anger finally overriding her fear. "I've served this family faithfully for years. I've never betrayed a confidence or failed in my duties. The fact that I have private doubts and occasionally feel overwhelmed doesn't make me a security risk." Morrison's expression remained professional, but she could see sympathy in his eyes. "Ma'am, I personally don't believe you pose any security risk. But there are people in positions of authority who have different concerns." "What people?" "Who has been monitoring my activities and reading meanings into my private thoughts." Before Morrison could answer, the door to the room opened and 2 men in expensive suits entered. They carried themselves with the authority of high-ranking government officials, and their presence immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. Morrison and his partner stood at attention, clearly recognizing these newcomers as their superiors. The older of the 2 men, distinguished and gray-haired, approached the table where Camilla's possessions were displayed. He picked up the diary and flipped through it casually, as if he had every right to examine her most private thoughts. "Your Royal Highness," he said without looking up from the diary, "I'm Director Hartwell from the Palace Security Service. I apologize for the inconvenience, but recent intelligence has raised concerns about your activities that require immediate investigation." Camilla stood up, drawing herself to her full height. "Director Hartwell, I demand to know what intelligence you're referring to and why my private possessions are being treated as evidence in some kind of investigation." Hartwell finally looked up from the diary, his cold gray eyes meeting hers without flinching. "Your Highness, 3 days ago we intercepted communications suggesting that certain members of the royal family might be targets for recruitment by foreign intelligence services. Your name was specifically mentioned." The revelation hit Camilla like a physical blow. Someone was trying to frame her as a potential traitor, using her private struggles and momentary weaknesses as proof of her vulnerability to foreign influence. Her attempted escape to France would be seen as further evidence of guilt, rather than simply a desire for privacy and peace. Director Hartwell's words hung in the air like a death sentence. Camilla felt the blood drain from her face as the full implications of his statement sank in. Someone, somewhere, had painted her as a potential security risk to the crown. Her private struggles, her moments of doubt, her simple desire for human connection, all of it was being twisted into evidence of disloyalty. "That's impossible," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I could never betray my country or my family. This is some kind of mistake. Hartwell set the diary down on the table and studied her face carefully. Your Highness, I want to believe that. But the evidence suggests a pattern of behavior that makes you vulnerable to foreign manipulation. The intercepted communications specifically mentioned your emotional state and your apparent dissatisfaction with royal life. Camilla's legs felt weak, and she sank back into her chair. What communications? Who would say such things about me? The second man, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. He was younger than Hartwell, with sharp features and calculating eyes. Your Highness, I'm Agent Mills from Counterintelligence. The communications we intercepted came from a source we've been monitoring for several months. They specifically mentioned your relationship with Dr. Richards and your ongoing correspondence with your sister in Australia. The mention of Dr. Richards, her former love, sent a shock through Camilla's system. She had been so careful to keep that relationship secret, even after it ended. How could foreign agents possibly know about something so private? Dr. Richards has been living in Africa for over 2 years, she said defensively. We haven't had any contact since the relationship ended. Agent Mills consulted a tablet device he was carrying. That's not entirely accurate, Your Highness. Our records show that Dr. Richards attempted to contact you through intermediaries as recently as 6 weeks ago. He was seeking to arrange a meeting during his brief return to London for a medical conference. Camilla's heart stopped. She remembered receiving a message through a mutual friend, asking if she would be willing to meet with someone who cared about her and wanted to ensure she was well. She had assumed it was just a concerned friend. Not realizing it might have been from Dr. Richards, she had politely declined the meeting without asking for details about who had made the request. I never met with anyone, she said quickly. I declined the meeting without even knowing who was asking. Hartwell picked up the bundle of letters from her sister. Your correspondence with your sister has also raised concerns. Some of her responses suggest that she may be in contact with journalists or other individuals who have expressed interest in your personal situation. Camilla felt as if the walls were closing in around her. Her sister had mentioned in a recent letter that a journalist had approached her, asking questions about Camilla's well-being and happiness. Her sister had refused to speak with the journalist, but apparently even that innocent contact was being used as evidence against them both. My sister would never betray me, Camilla said firmly. She's the most loyal person I know. Loyalty can be complicated, Your Highness, Agent Mills said. Sometimes people who care about us make decisions they think are in our best interest, without understanding the larger implications. Captain Morrison, who had been standing quietly throughout this exchange, finally spoke up. Directors, with respect, I've observed Her Highness's behavior today, and I see no evidence of deception or disloyalty. She seems genuinely surprised by these allegations. Hartwell turned his cold gaze on Morrison. Captain, your observations are noted. However, the most effective foreign agents are often those who appear completely innocent and trustworthy. Camilla realized with growing horror that nothing she said or did would matter. The case against her had already been built, and her attempted trip to France had provided the final piece of evidence they needed to justify their suspicions. Her desire for privacy and peace had been interpreted as an attempt to flee or meet with foreign contacts. What happens now? She asked, dreading the answer. For the immediate future, Your Highness, you will be returning to the palace under protective custody, Hartwell said. Your movements will be restricted while we conduct a thorough investigation into these allegations. Protective custody? Camilla repeated bitterly. You mean house arrest? We prefer to think of it as ensuring your safety while we resolve these security concerns, Agent Mills said smoothly. If you are innocent, as we hope you are, this situation will be resolved quickly and quietly. Camilla looked around the room at the faces surrounding her. Captain Morrison appeared genuinely sympathetic but powerless to help. His partner remained stoically professional. Hartwell and Mills showed no emotion whatsoever, treating her like a problem to be solved rather than a person whose life was being destroyed. My luggage, she said quietly. Will I at least be allowed to keep my personal belongings? Hartwell and Mills exchanged glances. Your clothing and basic personal items will be returned to you after inspection, Hartwell said. However, the letters, photographs, and diary will need to be retained as evidence pending the completion of our investigation. The thought of strangers poring over her most private thoughts and memories was almost unbearable. Those items represented the only genuine parts of her life, the only connections to real human emotion and experience. Without them, she would truly be isolated in her golden prison. "How long will this investigation take?" she asked. "That depends on many factors, Your Highness," Agent Mills replied. "If you cooperate fully and if our analysis confirms your innocence, it could be resolved in a matter of weeks. However, if additional concerns arise," he left the sentence hanging, the implication clear. If they wanted to, they could drag this investigation out indefinitely, keeping her under suspicion and surveillance for as long as they deemed necessary. Camilla closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She thought about the plane that should have carried her to France, now long departed without her. She thought about the cottage in the countryside where she had planned to read books, take long walks, and remember what it felt like to be human. All of that was gone now, replaced by the nightmare of being suspected of treason by the very institution she had served faithfully for years. When she opened her eyes, the men were still watching her, waiting for her response. She realized that she had no choice but to cooperate, even though every instinct told her that this cooperation would be seen as further evidence of guilt. The ride back to the palace was conducted in complete silence. Camilla sat in the back seat of an unmarked government vehicle, flanked by Captain Morrison and Agent Mills. Director Hartwell rode in the front passenger seat, occasionally speaking in low tones into his phone. Through the tinted windows, Camilla watched the familiar countryside pass by, each mile taking her further from the freedom she had desperately sought. Her mind raced with questions and fears. Who had orchestrated this investigation against her? Was it someone within the palace who had grown suspicious of her private struggles? Or was there truly a foreign intelligence operation targeting her? The timing seemed too convenient, too perfectly orchestrated to be coincidental. As they approached the palace gates, Camilla saw additional security personnel stationed at positions that were normally unguarded. The usually ceremonial guards had been supplemented with plainclothes officers who watched every vehicle with suspicious eyes. It was clear that her situation had triggered a significant security response. The car passed through multiple checkpoints before finally stopping at a side entrance that was rarely used for official business. This was the entrance typically reserved for staff and deliveries, designed to be inconspicuous and away from public view. Even now, they were taking precautions to ensure that her return under these circumstances would not attract media attention. Director Hartwell turned in his seat to address her. "Your Highness, when we enter the palace, you will be escorted directly to your private quarters. You are not to have contact with other family members or staff until this matter is resolved." "What about my lady-in-waiting?" Camilla asked. "She'll be expecting me to return from my trip in 2 weeks." "What will you tell her?" "Your staff will be informed that you've returned early due to a family emergency and are not to be disturbed," Agent Mills replied. "They will continue their regular duties but will not have access to your quarters." Camilla realized that her isolation would be complete. Even the people who helped her with daily tasks and provided some human companionship would be kept away. She would be alone with her thoughts and fears, with no one to talk to except the investigators who suspected her of treason. As they entered the palace through the service entrance, Camilla was struck by how different the familiar hallways looked when viewed through the lens of suspicion and confinement. Portraits of her ancestors seemed to stare down at her with judgment, as if they knew of her supposed crimes. The ornate decorations and priceless artwork that had once represented heritage and tradition now felt like the bars of an elegant prison. They climbed a narrow service staircase that led directly to the residential wing, avoiding the main corridors where they might encounter other family members or staff. Captain Morrison led the way, checking each hallway before allowing the group to proceed. The level of security was more appropriate for protecting a head of state than for escorting someone to their own home. When they reached her quarters, Director Hartwell produced a key and unlocked her door. Camilla was surprised to see that the lock had been changed. Clearly, preparations for her confinement had been made before she was even intercepted at the airport. "Your Highness," Hartwell said as he opened the door, "these will be your accommodations for the duration of the investigation. You will find that your rooms have been searched and secured, but your personal belongings remain largely undisturbed." Camilla entered her sitting room and immediately noticed the subtle changes. Books had been moved, drawers were not quite closed properly, and her personal papers had clearly been examined and reorganized. Even her most private space had been violated in her absence. Agent Mills handed her a small electronic device. This is a communication device that will allow you to contact Palace Security if you have any urgent needs. However, all communications will be monitored and recorded. What about phone calls to my family? Surely I'm allowed to speak with my sister. All external communications are suspended pending the completion of our investigation, Hartwell said firmly. This includes telephone calls, emails, and written correspondence. Camilla felt the full weight of her isolation settling over her like a heavy blanket. She was cut off from everyone who might provide emotional support or help her understand what was happening. Her sister in Australia would eventually wonder why her letters stopped coming. Dr. Richards, if he had indeed tried to contact her, would assume she was deliberately ignoring him. Captain Morrison approached her with what appeared to be a thick folder. Your Highness, these are the materials you'll need to review as part of the investigation. They contain transcripts of the intercepted communications, analysis of your personal correspondence, and timeline of events that have raised security concerns. Camilla took the folder with trembling hands. The idea of reading an official analysis of her private life was deeply disturbing, but she knew she needed to understand exactly what evidence was being used against her. How often will I be questioned? She asked. Daily interviews will begin tomorrow morning, Agent Mills replied. Each session will be recorded, and you are entitled to have legal representation present if you wish. Legal representation, Camilla repeated slowly. The phrase made everything feel more real and more terrifying. She was truly being treated as a suspect in a criminal investigation. Director Hartwell checked his watch and nodded to his team. We'll leave you to settle in, Your Highness. Someone will bring your dinner at the usual time, and tomorrow's interview will begin at 9 o'clock sharp. As the men prepared to leave, Captain Morrison lingered for a moment. When the others had stepped into the hallway, he spoke quietly to Camilla. Your Highness, I want you to know that I don't believe you've done anything wrong. This investigation will prove your innocence, and you'll get through this. His words of support brought tears to Camilla's eyes. After hours of being treated as a suspected traitor, even this small gesture of human kindness felt precious. Thank you, Captain, she whispered. Please don't forget that I'm human, not just a security problem to be solved. Morrison nodded and joined the others in the hallway. Camilla heard the new lock click into place, confirming that she was now officially a prisoner in her own home. She walked to her bedroom window and looked out at the gardens where she had once found peace and solitude. Even those spaces were now patrolled by security personnel, who watched for any sign of suspicious activity. Sitting down on her bed, Camilla opened the folder that contained the case against her. As she read the first page, a transcript of an intercepted phone call that mentioned her by name, she realized that her fight for vindication was just beginning. 3 weeks had passed since Camilla's confinement began, and the daily interrogations had become a grinding routine that wore down her spirit more with each passing day. Every morning at exactly 9 o'clock, Director Hartwell and Agent Mills would arrive at her quarters with their recording equipment and endless questions. They asked about every entry in her diary, every letter from her sister, every moment of doubt or frustration she had ever expressed. Camilla had read through the entire investigation file multiple times, and with each reading she became more convinced that someone had deliberately set her up. The intercepted communications were too convenient, too perfectly timed to be coincidental. Someone with access to her private information had fed details to foreign agents, knowing that those agents would then discuss her as a potential target, creating the very evidence that was now being used against her. On this particular morning, Camilla was surprised when Captain Morrison arrived alone, without the usual interrogation team. His expression was different, less formal, more urgent. He looked around her sitting room carefully before speaking, as if checking for hidden listening devices. Your Highness, he said quietly, I need to speak with you about some developments in your case. What I'm about to tell you is not officially sanctioned, but I believe you have the right to know. Camilla felt a spark of hope for the first time in weeks. What kind of developments? Morrison sat down across from her, leaning forward to keep his voice low. Our investigation team has been analyzing the source of those intercepted communications. The technical analysis shows that the information about you was provided by someone with intimate knowledge of your personal life and access to palace security protocols. You mean someone here, in the palace? Almost certainly, Morrison confirmed. The details about your relationship with Dr. Richards, the timing of your sister's letters, even knowledge of your planned trip to France, all of that information came from within our own security apparatus. Camilla felt a mixture of vindication and betrayal. She had been right to suspect that this was an inside job, but the reality that someone she trusted had orchestrated her downfall was still shocking. "Who?" she asked simply. Morrison hesitated before answering. "We believe it's someone in Agent Mills's department. The pattern of information flow suggests that whoever is responsible has been monitoring your activities for months, possibly years, and has been gradually building a case to use against you." "But why? What could they possibly gain from destroying me?" "That's what we're still trying to determine," Morrison said. "It could be personal revenge, financial gain from foreign sources, or part of a larger operation to destabilize the royal family." Morrison reached into his jacket and pulled out a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Your Highness, I'm taking a significant risk by doing this, but I wanted to return something to you." Camilla unwrapped the package and gasped when she saw her diary inside. The worn leather cover and brass lock were exactly as she remembered them. Her most private thoughts and feelings, the record of her deepest struggles and hopes, were being returned to her. "How did you?" "I made copies of everything for the official investigation file," Morrison explained. "But I believe these belong to you, not in some government evidence locker. After reading your diary, I'm more convinced than ever that you're innocent. Your struggles are human and understandable, not evidence of disloyalty." Tears streamed down Camilla's face as she held the diary against her chest. Having this piece of herself returned felt like getting back a part of her soul that had been stolen. "Captain, if you're right about there being a traitor in Mills' department, does that mean—" "It means that Agent Mills himself might be involved," Morrison said grimly. "The evidence is circumstantial, but he's had access to all the information that was leaked, and he's been the most aggressive in pushing the case against you." Morrison stood up and moved toward the window, checking to ensure they were not being observed. "Your Highness, I'm going to ask something of you that might be dangerous. We need to set a trap to catch whoever is responsible, but it will require you to trust me completely. What do you need me to do? Tomorrow during your regular interrogation, I want you to mention that you've remembered something important, a conversation you had with your sister that you hadn't told them about before. Make it sound like this conversation might contain information they would find valuable." Camilla was confused. "But what conversation?" "My sister and I have already told them everything." "There was no conversation," Morrison said. "That's the point. If Mills is working with foreign agents, he'll report this new information to his contacts. We'll be monitoring all communications, and if we see that information being passed along, we'll have proof of his betrayal." The plan was risky, but Camilla realized it might be her only chance to prove her innocence and identify the real traitor. What if it doesn't work? What if Mills isn't the one responsible? Then we'll have eliminated one suspect and can focus our investigation elsewhere, Morrison replied. "But Your Highness, I have to warn you, if Mills realizes what we're doing, it could make your situation much worse." Camilla thought about the weeks of isolation, the daily interrogations, the constant suspicion and surveillance. Her situation could hardly get much worse than it already was. "I'll do it," she said firmly. "But Captain, what happens if we catch Mills? Will that be enough to clear my name?" Morrison's expression was cautious. "It should be, Your Highness. If we can prove that the evidence against you was fabricated by a traitor within our own ranks, it will completely undermine the case against you." As Morrison prepared to leave, Camilla grabbed his arm. "Captain, why are you helping me? You could be risking your career, maybe even your freedom." Morrison looked at her with sincere eyes. "Your Highness, I swore an oath to protect the royal family from all enemies, foreign and domestic. That includes protecting innocent members of the family from false accusations and betrayal from within our own ranks." After Morrison left, Camilla sat alone with her returned diary, feeling a mixture of hope and terror about the plan they had discussed. Tomorrow's interrogation would either lead to her vindication or to even deeper trouble, but for the first time since this nightmare began, she felt like she had some control over her fate. She opened the diary to a random page and read her own words from months earlier. "Sometimes I wonder if anyone would notice if I simply disappeared from this life. Would they miss the person I am, or just the role I'm supposed to play?" Now facing the possibility of losing everything, Camilla realized that she had her answer. Captain Morrison had noticed her as a person, not just a royal title. He was willing to risk everything to help her because he saw her humanity and believed in her innocence. That knowledge gave her the strength she would need for whatever came next.